Hello, I'm here on the campus of Southern Wesleyan University. I have a special guest with me, and I'm in a very special place. Dr. Bob Black is here with me, and we are here at Freedom's Hill Church, and we're going to talk more about that at the end. But first, I just want to welcome Dr. Black. I'm so thankful for this opportunity and for you to come and just share a little bit with us today about the history of John Wesley and his life and the impact that he made. So first, I want you to take a moment and just introduce yourself.
Well, thanks, Eric. It's great to be with you and great to have a chance to speak, at least through this medium, to the people in your church, because the subject of John Wesley is very close to my heart, and I'm really happy to get a chance to share some of that this morning. I'm a third generation Wesleyan minister. I have taught at Southern Wesleyan for 32 years. I'm retired now, but I still teach one class a semester. And my degree field was in church history, so my dissertation was on John Wesley. It's been a lifelong study and a lifelong journey of appreciation for him and for what he meant, not just to our branch of the church, but to all of Christianity.
Yeah. So part of the reason that I wanted to meet with Dr. Black is to help you learn about John Wesley, but two very important things that he was passionate about, that I'm passionate about, and it's discipleship and it's social justice. Our church is diverse. We have a lot of people that don't know much about John Wesley, if anything about John Wesley. So first, we've got to just have a little introduction of who John Wesley was.
Right. Well, John Wesley was a minister in the Church of England in the 1700s. He came from a family of ministers, and his was an ordinary childhood in a pastor's home, with the exception that when he was 5 years of age, the parsonage caught on fire. The family all escaped except for young John, and they looked in to see him at a window on the second floor. He had not been able to get out of the building, and it was too late to go in after him. The family thought he was lost. And then two neighbors devised a brilliant plan. One stood on the shoulders of the other one. They made a human ladder, and one pulled him from the window of his bedroom just before the roof caved in. His mother, Susanna, said, "You are a brand plucked from the burning." That's a quotation out of the Minor Prophets. And it means basically you're a stick pulled out of the fire. God saved you for a reason. And she met with him an hour a week from that point on, just to focus on his spiritual life, his growth, his faith in God, what God had in store for him. So from childhood on, he was being told by his godly mother, God's got a plan for your life and you need to figure out what it is. And that set the stage for everything that came later. When he went to Oxford University, he was part of a club he and his brother Charles started. The other students called it the Holy Club, and they didn't mean that as a compliment. That was an insult. They said, "You think you're holier than we are, don't you?" But they didn't. They were just trying to go deeper in the things of God, and it became the birth of an idea that later on God would use when John Wesley became a change agent in the whole Church of England, when he began to make a difference in a wider circle. The turning point came at a small group meeting on Aldersgate Street in London. It was not a church service, it was not on Sunday. It's a weeknight meeting, but they were praying and reading and studying together, and John Wesley wrote in his journal, "I felt my heart strangely warmed. And I felt I did trust in Christ and Christ alone for my salvation." Wesley came to the conclusion that he had tried to be, previously, earning his salvation, trying to be good enough, trying to do enough good things for God. And at that weekday meeting, that small group meeting, it all changed for him. The light bulb came on. He saw that it was simply by grace through faith. He had read that before, but now it became a reality for him. And from that point on, the sky was the limit as far as the movement that John Wesley was able to begin was concerned. it became the Methodist Church. Not as originally a separate denomination. Originally it was a reform movement within the Church of England. In fact, John Wesley never resigned from his ministerial orders in the Church of England. He always considered himself a minister in the Church of England, but he had this heart experience with God. It didn't go over well with most of the ministers because they were preaching a more liberal form of Christianity. They were not interested in this heart change religion. They didn't want to hear you must be born again. And so door after door was closed to John Wesley, and he began to preach in the streets. He began to preach in the open fields. He began to preach wherever the people were. There's stories in his journal that he kept of preaching on the front porch of a house, or preaching sometimes after dark in the dining room standing on the table. He was 5'4". He needed to stand on something to be seen. He preached one memorable sermon on the tombstone of his father in the home church at Epworth, where he grew up, because the current pastor said, "You're not welcome in our church to preach." So he said, well, there's one spot on these grounds that belongs to me. That's my dad's tomb. And on this flat gravestone, he stood and preached in the afternoon to more people than had come to church that morning to hear the other preacher. That's the way the Methodist Church began. That's the way God began to revive not just the Anglican Church, but he began to revive all of Christianity in the 1700s. Most books will say John Wesley was the beginning of what we know today as the evangelical movement in the church, that stresses the second birth and that stresses the sense of mission and evangelism, that we're compelled to tell the story and to bring as many people as possible into the kingdom.
Yeah. So for the average churchgoer, especially somebody that's attending a Wesleyan church, why would you say that they need to know about John Wesley?
I'd first say everybody needs to know about John Wesley, but I'm a little prejudiced about that.
Right.
We especially need to know because our church, Wesleyan Church, came out of Methodism, and therefore it came out of John Wesley's original movement. In the 1800s, and we'll talk about this later when we talk about social justice, but in the 1800s, the Wesleyan Church left the Methodist movement because the Methodists were slow to stand against slavery. And the Wesleyan, the pastors in the Methodist Church who felt that was a strong, compelling application of the message of holiness, of love for our neighbor, to free him from chains, to give him liberty. It eventually led to them withdrawing from the Methodist Church and forming the Wesleyan Church. And when they did, this new church named itself after John Wesley, because they said basically we're the kind of Methodist John Wesley would be if he were still alive today. So the Wesleyan Church has its roots ultimately in John Wesley and his understanding of the gospel.
Yeah, that's important. That's important. So I was reading this book. Winfield Bevins was the author, and the book's called Church Planting Revolution. And the quote that he said in the book about John Wesley says that he knew that preaching was not enough to keep people in the faith. Wesley gathered people in small groups called class meetings for weekly prayer, instruction, and mutual fellowship. This is one of the most important things I want to talk about today is like Wesley's class system, what it was, the impact that it had on the revival in the 1700s, and just how it really helped people grow, and his heart for discipleship, because I have a heart for discipleship too. We have small groups at Hope Church. So tell us what a class system is and just the impact that had.
Yeah, let me go back to Wesley and bring it up to our application today. I mentioned that Wesley was preaching everywhere he could. He was preaching to the miners, the coal miners, as they went into work in the morning and came home in the afternoon. He was preaching on town squares. He was preaching in friendly homes. The other ministers complained to the bishop, and they said, we have shut the doors of our church to him, but now he's preaching on our streets. He's preaching in our neighborhood. You need to tell him to stop. Wesley was still a minister in the Church of England, so the bishop called him on the carpet, literally. He said, meet me in my office. We've got to talk about this. And when Wesley arrived, he said, you have to stop. You're preaching on other people's turf. You're not in their church, but you're in their neighborhood. And in the parish system of the Church of England, The local minister was in charge of that area, not just where his sanctuary was, but the area around it as well. And so Wesley said, you don't understand. The world is my parish, not just a neighborhood, not just a local church area. The world is my parish. God's called me to preach wherever there's a need. And that idea, the world is my parish, was at the heart of the growth of his movement, I think, because he felt free to go anywhere and to spread the gospel. They weren't hearing it faithfully preached on Sunday mornings in their churches back then, but they could hear it in his movement. And his movement sprang up wherever the people who came to be called Methodist had an opening to start a local ministry. And the way they did it was not to compete with the local church, so they didn't have a Sunday morning service. But they built small chapels, and in the small chapels they would meet on Sunday evening. Sunday evening was their main service. That was the preaching service. But then Wesley said, preaching's not enough, just like you said, Eric. Preaching's not enough. What about the other 6 days of the week? And so he started the class system. The class system sounds like you're in school, but it's not that kind of class. It wasn't a class where you studied or took tests. It's from a Latin word that means small group. So we would say today he started a small group movement.
Yeah.
Remember, he got his life turned around in a small group back at Aldersgate Street when he felt his heart strangely warm. Now he is giving other people that opportunity too. So when the congregation of people who desired to go deeper than the Church of England was taking them at the time, especially their liberal pastors on Sunday mornings, they would come to the chapel on Sunday night, but one other night in the week at least, they would give to a class meeting. The classes were groups that could not be larger than 12. If you got larger than 12, you started a new class. And they were both men and women mixed together. And the idea was to encourage one another in the faith, to build each other up, to be a support system for one another. So if you were an early Methodist in those days, and don't confuse that with today's United Methodist Church, but this is the Methodism that John Wesley started. Strongly evangelical, strongly biblical. If you were a Methodist in those days, you went to the Methodist chapel on Sunday night, but then at least one other night a week, you went to a class meeting with 10 or 11 other people who would encourage you and build you up in the faith, and you would build them up in the faith. If you were really eager to grow in grace, you gave another night to what he called the band meeting. The bands were smaller groups. They couldn't be larger than 6, and they were divided by sex, so it was all men or all women. The reason for that was so that they could talk very frankly about things like sexual temptations, for instance, without being in a mixed society.
Right.
So it was all men or all women. And the idea here was a little different from the class meeting support system. This was heavy duty accountability. It's in the band meetings that people would say, well, Bob, what temptation have you faced this week? And Bob would have to tell them, to be honest, if you're going to be in a band meeting, you've made a commitment to level with each other. That's highly personal, isn't it? Well, the idea was, if we're going to be in this together to help you, you have to be open about these things. What temptations have you faced this week? The next question is, how did you deal with them? Did you yield to them? If so, then we need to pray for your forgiveness and return to the flock. If you manage to avoid those temptations, let's talk about how to succeed in similar ways in the future. And it was really very close to the heart of the gospel in direct application to everybody's life. The idea is the gospel is not just words on a page. This is supposed to be the way that you and I live week in and week out. And the band groups, not everybody went into a band group. It took a little spiritual fortitude to go in there. But if you went into a band group, you were prepared for people to ask you the tough questions, and you could ask them the tough questions. And the result was people grew. People grew like they'd never grown before. We today have small groups in our churches. Small groups of different kinds. They have different functions. But I hope that the point of all of those small groups is to bring us closer to God, maybe in different ways, but to bring us closer to God. And we owe John Wesley a debt of gratitude for the way that his small group system that he called class meetings, society meetings were the Sunday night preaching services, but then class meetings and band meetings during the week, made the faith come alive to people. It wasn't just something that they touched base with God once a morning and once a week in church, but it's something they lived all through the week. And Wesley deserves a great deal of credit for that, I think.
Yeah. So in this class system, because there's all kind of small groups today, they emphasize prayer was a big thing, right? They emphasize really praying for each other.
Yeah.
And praying, accountability even in the class groups.
Sure.
A lot of accountability in that. There were certain questions they went through too, right?
Yeah.
I know a lot of people use those questions today. How many? Do you remember the questions?
20-some different questions
20?
that he
Oh,
could
wow.
ask. Yeah.
They went through all these questions. A lot of accountability, of course, some instruction and prayer, encouragement. What fascinated me in this multiplication class that I was taking is just to see how that helped spur the revival on. Like you said, he's preaching anywhere and everywhere people were, but he didn't just, like maybe you see today, just preach, pack up tent and leave. He's like, hey, we need to start a group here, a class here.
Yeah.
So there was this, maybe talk for a moment about this multiplication spirit that Wesley had, where he's like, hey, we got to multiply groups, because he emphasized that, didn't he? He's like, we got to multiply this group. This group's not just not just your little huddle. This group should be multiplying, right?
Yes.
And this leader should be multiplying.
Absolutely.
So talk about that multiplication spirit that he had that I think was one of the keys to helping that revival just keep going.
Well, it's based in large part on the fact that he was willing to use lay people who were not ministers in spreading the gospel. People had been told by the Anglican Church, if you're not an ordained minister, then it's not your job to spread the gospel. You just come to church and you hear the gospel preached. Well, they didn't preach it very well most of the time. But Wesley said the whole concept was wrong. The idea is that every Christian is supposed to be a minister in that sense. Not every Christian is ordained, but every Christian is supposed to spread the gospel.
Yes.
And so he used lay people. He used ordinary people who had occupations through the week that earned a living for their family. But on Sunday night at the worship service, they would be in leadership. They would be the ones who did the preaching. Wesley couldn't preach at all of those chapels. He had dozens and dozens of chapels, eventually hundreds of chapels in England. And they weren't led by ordained ministers at first. They were led by lay people who had found the Lord in the small group meetings or in other society meetings on Sunday nights, and they became the agents of revival for the rest of the church. So one key ingredient is the way that Wesley used lay preachers. Church of England, again, tried to stop Wesley, and they said, you can't do that. Wesley pointed to the Constitution of the Church of England, and it clearly stated that this was permissible. So the bishop couldn't stop him. He was steadily building and multiplying the movement through these lay preachers. Another way that he multiplied it was by the accountability of keeping a roll of who came to Sunday night services and who came to the class meetings or the band meetings during the week. If you missed a band meeting or a class meeting, somebody would contact you. It wasn't come if you can. It was, no, you're committed to this.
Wow.
Unless you were sick or away, you were supposed to be there. And eventually, and this sounds so far out to us today, he began to issue tickets to the Sunday night society meetings, and you needed a ticket to get in. Now, you could bring an unsaved friend and get them in if they came with you, but otherwise you needed a ticket to get in. And how did you earn your ticket? You were regular in your attendance at the class meetings, and if you chose to be in a band, at the band meetings. So Wesley was saying, no, we're serious about this. His friend George Whitefield was a great evangelist. He came to America and helped start the First Great Awakening in America. George Whitefield was a better preacher than John Wesley. But at the end of his life, George Whitefield said, I look back on my ministry and my converts, that is the people who came to the Lord under my ministry, I can't find them. I don't know, they've left no mark. And he said the reason that my ministry is different from Wesley's is that Wesley had these ways through the societies and the classes and the bands of tying people together, giving them an identity. That identity later became the Methodist Church. And then using them to reach others. Whitefield said, my problem has been that I've managed to be an agent of the Lord to save some people, but I don't know if those people ever led anybody to the Lord. I don't know if those people ever organized any ministries of their own. His expression was, my converts are a rope of sand. They're not there anymore.
Wow.
But Wesley's converts became a movement in the church. And the multiplication factor was key to that. It really was.
Yeah. I want people to hear that too. I want you to hear that because we need another revival in the church.
Right.
We need another revival, and we need accountability for the people that come to know Christ and to help them grow. And that's why just trying to figure out these, we call them life groups, that's our small group ministry, to people to understand, to get involved, that you need accountability, you need to grow, you need prayer, and the pastor can't do it all.
That's right. That's right.
And we flipped it around in America. We looked at that too much. And if you can just grasp the fact that there was a revival going on and that it was encouraged and spurred on by the simple fact that people got together in small groups and they had a multiplication mindset to where this group is going to grow. And I, as a leader, I'm going to grow. I got to come up with another leader. And so another leader, another group, another leader, another group. And so he went somewhere else and he preached, appointed a leader with a group, take care of these people, pray together.
Right.
And it just, you can just sense the revival and the spirit just going on because they all had a multiplication. It wasn't like, oh, well, 20 people got saved, we're going to make 2 groups and we're just going to sit around and sing our hymns and pray for each other and still have our 20 groups. And like, no, those 20 people got to reach more people and we got to have more groups and more leaders.
Yeah.
And in that multiplication class, that's just what I found so excited. Actually, that's one of the reasons I called you, because I'm like, one man makes such a difference. And this simple structure of, hey, it's more than preaching. And see, I'm a pastor. It's very easy to say, hey, you just need to come to church on Sunday morning. You just need to listen to the word. But it's more than that. It's so much more than that.
Yeah. And your expression, one man made a difference, is exactly right. And the key is, the way he made a difference was by not assuming that one man can do it all.
Right.
One man made a difference by turning to other men and women and saying, you're responsible for this too. Let me help you. Let me equip you to be able to do this. That's what Paul meant in Ephesians when he said God's given some gifts of pastoring, teaching, evangelism, and so forth. But then the sentence goes on to say, to build up God's people for works of service. So the whole idea of the ministry is not to do all of the ministering. The whole idea of the ministry is to prepare other people to be ministers in their own right. Not ordained perhaps, but serving and leading and witnessing and sharing and growing the church. Somebody said the church is kind of like a football game. There's, in a football game, you got 22 men on the field who are desperately in need of rest, and 100,000 people in the stands who are desperately in need of exercise. If that's like the church, then you've got ministers who are working themselves to death, trying to build the church. But look at all of the people in the pew, in the seats, who can be ministers of the gospel, and God's intent is for them to be ministers of the gospel in spreading the word.
Yes. So there's great potential
Absolutely.
in you.
Absolutely.